Real strength may be found in our weaknesses. For the past few weeks, we have been revisiting the stories of David here at Central Christian, the most powerful king of ancient Israel, whose power was the result of his conquest over foreign tribes and armies and his ruthlessness as king. Today we switch gears a bit and visit the early church at Corinth. Paul was responding to reports of divisions and abuses within the young Christian community in Corinth. It seems that some, as he called them, super apostles, had been manipulating the infant church, preying on them, perhaps shaming them, and even maybe physically abusing them. So in other words, these super apostles were bully types, standing on top of the mountain, wanting to push everybody around. The question then with the infant church is similar to those that we ask today. How do we distinguish between true and false teachers or prophets in our midst? Who should we allow to influence us, and whose authority can we ultimately trust? For me, one of the most influential teachers I had was my dad. He wasn't a college-educated person. He did not have wealth in worldly measure. He wasn't a brute in size by any means, although he had 4 arms like Popeye. And for my brothers and I, he'll always be our Superman. In faith, he was agnostic for much of his adult life. Having been left with a sour taste for the church as a young man, he found his way to a more fuller belief and was baptized right here in this baptistry at 59 years of age. He never denied God, nor did he ever stop questioning and answering with those simple, important words, especially for the ears of an inquisitive child and young adult. Those words are 3 little words. I don't know. I don't know. I read in a recent Christian Century column by Peter Marty that theologian Leslie Weatherhead once noted that the word agnostic has a constructive place in Christian conversation. The agnostic, he said, who is uncertain about God, different from the atheist, who denies the existence of God, and who says with powerful honesty, the agnostic, I don't know. That one, the theologian claims, may be on the road to great faith. That was my dad. And that was the Apostle Paul. No coincidence, perhaps. My dad's middle name that he shared with me since I'm his junior was Paul. Paul, though, speaking about a friend who had had an experience of an encounter with the holy, says, on behalf of such a one, I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. A thorn, Paul says, was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too conceited. In their recent book, The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone, Stephen Sloman and Philip Fernbach say, we're not so good at knowing what we don't know. We're not so good at knowing what we don't know. Says Peter Marty in his column about their book, we underestimate our own ignorance. We underestimate our own ignorance. This is especially true in today's culture. Confusing the knowledge that's within in our own heads with what we constantly rely on from other people and external associations. In other words, he says, knowledge is communal. Complex webs, he describes, of shared information allow a lot of our cursory knowledge to reside in other people's heads. As individuals, we know surprisingly less than we often think we do. Let me say that again. As individuals, we know surprisingly less than we often think we do, even if we have our own little domains of expertise. Now, I'm sure none of us are like this, but I'm sure we've met people. We've met individuals who, if you ask them about anything, or if you have an inquiry about anything, they have the answer, right? They have it. It's probably on their smartphone, somewhere in Google or something like that, but they have the answer. And because they can do this quick little search and get this little tidbit of information, all of a sudden, they are a medical doctor who has had residency status and 8 years of medical school. They can tell you exactly what's wrong with you and what you need to do to cure it. Right? It may not be in the medical world, though. It could be something about your car or your garden or your child. Your child's doing something and they know everything about parenting. Everything that will make this child be the person that you want them to be, not the person they're going to become, perhaps, right? So we know what this is like. We've experienced this, no doubt, in our life. But in our culture today, I think it's more prevalent than ever that younger generations, but even some of our older generations, think they know everything. Everything. And no one's going to tell them any different. And what this book and this author is trying to say is that a lot of what we know is just things we're collecting out here in the common intelligence. And the problem is that nobody is regulating that common information, right? And so whether we want that regulated or not, but nobody's watching over that to see if it's fact or fiction, if it's truth or if it's a falsehood, if it even stands up to the basic common understandings of humanity. And so we are influenced daily by a barrage of different kinds of influencers, from media to our social circles, to our work circles, to our family circles. We're influenced, and this is the knowledge we have. And it's not all bad. Some of that is very good. And some of that is just not right, factual, provable, experienced, etc. by other people in this big world. So the point we're trying to make with all of this is that we know surprisingly less than we often think we do, and that we underestimate our own ignorance most of the time. And the point that Paul is trying to make, I believe, is that I don't know is a very, very powerful phrase. A very, very powerful phrase. Peter Marty said, "Something in the Christian life ought to inspire us to limit our arrogance about certain things we know, and at the same time nurture a disposition of gratitude for those we know that we don't." Or those who know that what we don't, right? So, in other words, we should have a humility about the things that we know, and at the same time nurture a gratitude, a thanksgiving for those who know what we don't. And I think that's a huge thing for us today in this culture. Being grateful for those who have learned and achieved and gone and got a higher education and have studied and have experimented and have tried and true. To have an appreciation for that, I think, is something we're often missing in our culture today, because Google has all the answers. When we were on a college visit the other day, one of the things that this particular college was trying to sell us on was the fact that as a very small school, there are no teaching assistants teaching classes. So there are no people who are non-tenured, non-PhD professors teaching classes there. You get the real deal, as they would say. You get the person who is an expertise in their field of study. Whereas if you go to some larger institutions, the underclass groups, the freshman and sophomore classes, might often get in their basic general requirement classes a teacher's assistant, somebody who's working on their master's degree. But that person may have just graduated from college just a few months before, and they're teaching your young person. So the sales pitch was, you won't get that here. Your young person will get the expert in the field, top in their field, teaching those classes. And it's a point that's well taken. The point that I'm trying to make with it, of course, is the appreciation for those who have put in that work of study and trying to understand our human world and then share it with us, and that disposition of gratitude for those who know what we don't. I read somewhere else that when we look closely at life, there really seems to be a correlation between weakness and spirituality. It seems the more vulnerable we realize that we really are, the more open we make ourselves to the presence of God, and the deeper our faith and our spirituality. It's sort of like the old but probably untrue saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. When we are the most vulnerable, it seems to be the place when we reach out to God. It's when the agnostic at least will say, well, God, if you're really there, I really need you now. On the contrary, the more that we try to protect ourselves, to control our lives, and to avoid pain and weakness, the more we cut ourselves off from the presence of God, and the weaker our faith and spirituality. That means the very path to discovering new strength is through embracing and facing our weaknesses. But in order to do that, we have to take the step of faith that God's grace is truly sufficient for us in any and every crisis we find ourselves. Several years ago, my dad was hospitalized with symptoms of heart failure. Today is the anniversary of his birthday, by the way. He was told that the surgery he needed was too risky for him at that point. I lived in Indiana at the time, and I had to return to seminary, leaving Dad in the cardiac unit here in Kankakee. He told me that he had an experience the night before I left, an encounter with the Holy. He saw himself at a lakeshore, and God's voice comforted him, assuring him he was going to be all right no matter what happened. We talked about having no unfinished business between us that day, and I returned to my coursework and ministry in Indiana. Had he been to paradise? I don't know. God knows. I know he lived 20 more years after that and underwent a bunch of procedures. I know that both of us were scared, felt helpless and weak, and in those vulnerable moments found the grace of God to let go if need be, to keep hope despite the odds. It was a powerful moment for both of us, one we revisited each time he faced a new hurdle, and each time we found grace and peace. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made in weakness. Amen.